Let's talk all about AI in business. It's hosted by Brent Muller. Welcome to the Future Proof Podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Future Proof Podcast. I'm your host, Brent Muller. I'm really excited today to introduce Mike here in a second, but really quickly for everybody out there that is watching the podcast, wondering who we are. We're a B2B growth company, and we help B2B companies scale their revenue. We built our own AI-powered platform, which is powered by AI, and it outperforms all the other platforms by 2 to 5x on growth. It's really just meant to get more sales qualified conversations. So if you're interested in any of that, want to take your business to the next level, just DM us or put growth in the comments, and one of our team members will get in touch with you. But let's jump into today's episode. Let me introduce you to Mike Gadsby from On3 World. Mike, we are really excited to have you today.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. So let's jump right in and hit your background real quick, because you have immense expertise in this area. And then we're going to just jump into a couple of areas and deep dive.
Sounds great. Yeah. So just some background. My company is O3. We are digital experience consultants out of Philadelphia. We're headquartered in Philadelphia. We have staff kind of all over the country, all over the world, actually. So my background is, I was a designer coming out of college. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I have a background in business. I got into design towards the end of college since the late 90s. That immediately turned into an interest in the internet when that started to become a thing. And I guess I've just kind of always been on the edge of sort of the next iteration of innovation, right? Initially, it was, the web and the internet, then it was mobile, and then it became, as digital products started to become central to businesses. First of all, O3 was founded in 2005. So as we started to develop along with that, all of a sudden we started to develop strength and expertise in user experience, and really a focus on how user experience can drive business. And over that time frame, we became, far more about, creating strategic decisions that are based in business logic versus, trying to make things work better. And then we've gotten more and more onto the consulting side of the house in the last 5 or 6 years. And that's really what we do now. Bread and butter of the business is really going in, understanding either gaps, friction points that exist either in customer experiences or employee experiences, and then solving those problems through some digital solution. Build a lot of apps, a lot of websites, a lot of digital properties, but these days we're doing a ton of work in AI, personalizing, creating conversational solutions, or really maximizing efficiency through workflow automation.
Love it. And as we were talking before, I am high on all of those things. So you have some really cool topics that you deep dived on before. Best place to start? Maybe we start with the customer experience, then we get into the data, because my philosophy on all this is what AI is doing from a digital experience, and you tell me how you think, Mike, but it's creating personalization at scale, right? We've always been a one-to-many, right? Hey, how do I talk to this audience or that audience? What we really want is someone to talk to me directly, right? Are you
100%.
seeing that? Are you seeing that?
100%. And it's funny. So we've been in and around AI as an organization for a better part of a decade. And personalization has always been one of those key topics that we've discussed. The problem with personalization is, for years, we just really didn't have enough of the machinery to really make it work. But what we've always wanted was this kind of idea of like perpetual personalization, right? Same as you would have if you knew somebody who knew you very well and was trying to help you with something, right? They would have all the context in the world about you. They would know everything about you. So when you ask the question, joke, but often when I ask my wife is, where's the thing? She knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because she's known me forever. And she knows what time of day it is. She knows what I'm trying to accomplish. Maybe I'm trying to leave for work. She knows what I got to do to get my kids out the door. Whatever the case is, she has that context, right? She has that meaning, right? Well, now we're getting to the point where it's getting scary good how well AI can get to know us and what it can do in order to really create that mass personalization, right? Or what we call hyper-personalization down to the individual, right? So I am 100% aligned with that, particularly from a customer experience standpoint. And I think that's fundamentally what everybody wants in a great customer experience, right? They just want they want to feel unique. They want to feel special. They want everything to be as easy as possible, right? Years ago, we talked about like the Amazon button, that one-click button, right?
Right.
point where the idea of even clicking on a button is silly.
Yeah.
Like if I want to ask for something, especially at the rise of like AI agents right now, the expectation is I'm going to go, type in, I need a thing done. 50 buttons are going to go get pressed. So that sort of personalization, not just the idea of answering your question or providing you with the right product, but really taking 5 or 6 actions on your behalf. Wow. I mean, we're in a really cool place.
Really cool place. And I know this is where it goes into the next level, but talk about some of the behavioral dynamics. One of the things that we have on our side is one of the companies that I'm a co-founder in is a data company. And we've always said, whenever we could get to the point where we could use this data to personalize the experience, especially the behavior, imagine, right, how different that customer experience is. You're deeper in it. So tell the audience about,
So let's start with data in general. So not all data is equal.
Sure.
There's actually a couple of topics here. So one is, I think one of the things that people need to be aware of when we talk about data, and especially when we talk about behavior, is this trade-off between what I'm willing to give you as a consumer versus what I need to take back as far as that personalized experience.
The value exchange, right?
That value exchange,
Yeah.
exactly,
Right.
right? And going back to what I was just saying before, like, we're getting better and more comfortable with the idea that like I'm going to give you more as long as I keep getting more from that experience, right? I joke, but I hear people like complain about privacy issues and whatnot. I don't have the heart to tell them like, I'm sorry, your social security number is readily available for everybody on the
everybody,
out
no
there.
matter, yeah.
I don't know when that happened to everybody, but
Yeah.
it happened,
Yeah.
right?
Go on the
So-
dark web, it's there.
Yeah, it's really hard for people to really think about it from that perspective, but you've already given over a lot of your data, right? So our comfort levels, I think, in general, have become a lot higher. Now, whether or not they should be for privacy concerns or whatnot, it's a whole other conversation. But that trade-off, at least from a consumer exchange or patient exchange or whatever we're talking about, is really integral to this. But what that matters is from a data perspective, particularly if you're a marketer or if you're a product person and you're trying to think about what I can do with that data, it's that you get the data right?
Yeah.
Cleansing data, transforming data, making sure that data is giving you what you need. We do a lot of knowledge-based solutions, right? So custom knowledge bases based on like huge repos of, say, sales data or presentations or whatever the case the company might have, right? And the thinking is, oh yeah, 10 years of this information and we can just go throw ChatGPT at it and we should be good to go. But if you asked somebody to dive into a bin of 50 proposals and ask them a question and go find it and produce it back, and you had 5 proposals that were exactly the same with slight nuanced changes, how would you know which one is which, right? You wouldn't, the AI is not going to know that. Right? No different than you would. So it's so important that we think about data from a structural standpoint, that we get that right? Because if we get that right, we get the knowledge right, then we can get the experience right? So that's the first part of it. Then going back to the value exchange, right? Then it's a matter of figuring out, okay, what do these layers look like that we have to build in between one, but personal information that we're looking for in order to personalize that experience, behavioral dynamics that we start to create around what do we do with the information once I start to tack on not just the profile information, but the behavioral information, right? The stuff where all of a sudden I'm giving you little bits and pieces of information that the AI can take cues from to understand, right? The time of day you're interacting, right? The context for which you're interacting based on 5 or 6 questions or actions that you took prior to that, right? That all matters, right? So how we then begin to behave as users with the AI starts to change and evolve over time, which is a really interesting topic.
Yeah,
what
really.
what I was saying before about the Amazon button, for instance, right? Like I'm so like fascinated with this, but at some point, somewhere, that it is going to become not a thing anymore. Right? At some point, somewhere.
You know how big it was when they first put it out there? People like, one click? Well, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, it was crazy. Like it was one of those things where it was probably like the most lucrative design decision ever. Like, but now it's finally kind of probably going to come up against its end to some degree, right? People always want to click buttons and whatnot, but like for the most part, if we can make that easier, that's going to be such a bigger thing. So how we begin to sort of interact, it's an exchange, right? All of a sudden, what consumers will give you and what they expect back in that sort of rapid exchange of information, how clean the data is in order to really make that valuable. These are all the things we're thinking about.
Yeah. And so when you think about data, right? Do you think it becomes, again, we've had this conversation internally with my other company, is does it become a commodity? Does it become more valuable when you layer AI on top of it? Because, like you said, data everywhere, it's readily available, but it does matter how you bring it together, to your point
Yeah.
about structuring it to teach the AI how to use it in the best and highest use. What's your view on that? Right? Because again, we've had this conversation with data companies going, guys, I don't know if this is as valuable as you thought it once was.
So it'll be interesting to see what we're talking about as far as the integral parts of that data, right? So like the 23andMe news that just came out around, what are they doing with all this DNA information, right? That is extremely valuable data.
That is.
All sorts of things about a human because of the DNA structure, right? And then their relationship with others and all sorts of things, right? Very interesting things like health dynamics and whatnot, right? Like these are that's
Healthcare data is a whole nother animal, right? The value in that is just off the charts, right? Yeah.
So like let's start to tack back to probably more readily available data, right? Like typical marketing demographic data,
firmographic, right?
segmentation data, right? Stuff that is useful and necessary, right? Because it's good to know that you fit in one camp or another. But how hyper personalized can you get an experience when that's the expectation if the data and the information is so broad? This is where I think one of the more interesting topics that you're going to start to see is the use of synthetic data modeled off of segmentation data to really start to figure out and predict what a hyper personalized experience looks like. So what do I mean by that, right? So let's say you take a group of 100 individuals, right? And these are actual individuals who are interacting constantly, and we're taking that information and we're going to use that information essentially to build profiles that we can then ask AI to interact with and start to have conversations with, or start to make predictions on next best action and stuff like that, and then train it, right? Yes, that's right. Yes, that's wrong, whatever the case is. All of a sudden, that like initial data that we're collecting, it's not that it's not valuable, it's very valuable. But if we can duplicate it pretty quickly and we can start to make, other assumptions, then we can start to see what happens with those AI interactions, and you can start to guess what's going to happen next. And all of a sudden, AI is pretty smart. It's going to start making some decisions on a lot of that, where all of a sudden, then that initial data that we're collecting isn't as valuable. And if it's not as valuable, then you're probably, as a customer, not going to care as much that they're collecting that on you, right? All those cookie things you accept, right? They're going to become a lot less of a thing that you're worried about. I guess that's the big picture, right? It's going to be the level and the depth of the data and how hyper personalized that data happens to be, whether we're talking about something as specific and down in the weeds as health data, or something as high level as just kind of what group do I fit in as far as my geolocation is concerned.
Yeah, exactly. And the other one that I think that could move the needle a little bit is behavioral intent. And what I mean by that is, my partner always said, when you can see someone's search behavior, you're peering into the mind of what is top of mind for them, but and they're basically they're in a specific product, a bottle of wine, and again, these are just product things, but when you start to get into other things, the questions that they ask, right? And then as you start to figure out how AI changes search like that, right? Now that stuff, those behaviors become much more in depth. That can lead to a completely different hyper personalization, because now those questions they're asking are just going to go into, instead of a Google search, they're going into an AI interface, right?
Yeah, totally. Totally. I think what you're also going to see with that, though, too. So I'm a big believer in that, like, search was always broken to begin with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we built apps.
We weren't built to have keywords. We were like that.
No,
you're right.
I think back to all of these like platforms and these products we would plug into like websites over the years, and just to make search better. And like in the grand scheme of things, all it did was like maybe predict the next keyword, and it just made the job of putting in the keywords a little bit easier. And maybe the results came back in a little bit of a different way, so that you could, didn't have to funnel through 15 pages to get to the thing you were actually looking for.
Yeah.
I do believe that conversational search is a really important upgrade in how we look for information. And
I agree.
I think what you're getting at there, which I think it is an important point, and we're talking about intent, right, is how my other conversations add up to lead to that conversation, right? Long-term memory is a really interesting thing when we think about how well an experience is designed or captured. It's honestly my favorite thing about ChatGPT, as I use it personally, is that I love long-term memory. People are like worried about that. I want to get rid of that. I don't want to train the AI.
No way.
I'm like,
I want it to know as much as it can.
totally. And if I go back to I mean, clearly I'm not like, I'm not as worried about some of the stuff I'm feeding it. And I do believe, just to full,
Yeah.
just getting all on the table, I do believe people need to protect themselves. Don't misunderstand me. I think people need to be aware of what they are giving it and what they're getting back.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to be so nonchalant about that. But I do think, if of what I'm trying to get out of it, and I'm trying to understand something, and the more I give it, the more I'm going to get out of it. I just think that's like the best possible experience, because I don't want a web page. I just want the information. I just want an answer, right? Like, it's no different than when you get tired of searching, you couldn't find it, and then maybe you ask a friend because you're like, I don't know, I couldn't find it on the internet, and then somebody has some knowledge to share, right? Like, now where it's so readily available that you're going to get it. Now, of course, you need to double check. You need to use maybe tools like Perplexity that have sourcing so that, whatever.
Yeah.
But
no, but you're right. Like, and for everyone that doesn't know what Mike just said is, because I have tons of folks that have not even heard of Perplexity. I'm like, if you want to know where the chat got its sources from, you use Perplexity, right? Yeah.
Well, I think the sourcing is not as bad on ChatGPT these days. We use Claude as
it is
well,
getting better, right?
Like, I mean, all of these tools are going to get better and better. Like, I'm less concerned about that over time. But like, I guess the point of all of it is back to your point about intent, right? Like, I think that is a fundamental component. Context is a fundamental component to the future of experience, right?
Yeah.
Like, everything about how we got here is going to matter for where we're going next.
Right.
And I think it's just such an important point. I use a really great example, and this literally happened like yesterday, right? I'm dealing with like some super minor health issues, but like, essentially I'm just trying to figure out how to lower my A1C a little bit in my blood work, right? I went on this diet, I started, changing all these things, right? And I went and did my blood work, and it was like about the same. And I'm like annoyed, right? So I'm like trying to figure out like, all right, what is it in my diet? So one thing sort of rings a bell, and it's like, I still have a few beers here and there, right? Maybe it's something in beers. So I asked the question, like, I was like, how much sugar is in this, and like, what's the impact? And ChatGPT gave me some really interesting information to come along with it. Now, I had a few conversations on many over the course of the last year, and all of a sudden it asked me. It gives me the name of my favorite beer, and it said, "Would you like me to check what the content is for this and its impact to your A1C?" That is wild. There are maybe 3 people in the world who know what my favorite beer is, right? It's my wife and probably a couple of my really good buddies, right? Like, and that's it.
Yeah.
Right. ChatGPT knows that now. And that next step, that context, wow. Like, that is just wild. That is probably some information I gave it like a year and a half ago. And it's leveraging that and using that information to bring back to the table to really create that context, to make that experience possible to me. So again, you go back to intent. Those are the doors we're opening.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll give you a great follow-up example to that, right? So I have a good friend who's been, he has one of those odd things happening to him intermittently, health-wise. It's not bad, but no one can figure it out. And he's been to like 5 of the most reputable places in the country, right? And he put into chat, like, he's like, he was at his wit's end, and he put in ChatGPT all the tests they did, all the things they found, all his symptoms, right? And he's like, I'm at my wit's end. I don't know what else. And it crunched through it and said, oh, have you tried this and this? And he's like, no one's ever told me to try that. I never thought of that. And right, lo and behold, now that like they feel like that they're onto something. And whether or not that's it or not, but it gave them ideas that 5 of the most like well-known places, right? We're talking Duke, Vanderbilt, like this kind of stuff, right? And to me, that's the kind of breakthroughs that you can do with that long-term memory you're talking about.
Totally. Yeah. Listen, this still comes back to just, it's a component that we didn't have access to before.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're all excited about, by the way.
And that's really what it's about. Like, I think context as a core component, like to your friend's example there, right? Like, we've been thinking a lot about like the future of the healthcare experience. And I think exactly what you touched on is the number one problem with healthcare. We're dealing with like a healthcare deficit, right?
Yes.
We're a reduction of doctors and nurses in the world as the population continues to explode. Like, that's a known
problem. And those one-off things are going to continue to pop up, and they're just, unless you can.
And then
Yeah.
But like, how many doctors remember who you are? Right. That's why they have notes. They got to look through the records. They got to go through all that every time they sit down with you. And especially as someone who thinks about this stuff on a regular basis, I'm constantly looking at it. And I was like, and over a course of time, you're like, how well can you possibly treat me if you don't know the basics of my health and background?
Right.
Now, your friend obviously should pass that by a physician.
Yeah. That's what he's going to do. Right. Right. Yeah.
Whatever we go next, right? There's a human involvement in this
Yes.
for sure. But man, what does that do to empower the physician, empower the healthcare provider in order to provide that level of service that they can legitimately treat in a much better way? I mean, that's what we're talking about is, that context, bringing that back to the table, core component to future of experience.
Yeah. And that's, on the healthcare side, you bring it back to the consumer side, and any experience with brands and stuff, it becomes, a very similar thing to where you can, track, measure, improve on all of this stuff. And I had a couple of people on the podcast recently that are into the neuroscience and how humans interact with brands through colors and all that. Man, when you start to bring that in, how much of improvement of things are going to happen really fast.
Yeah, now you're talking some interesting stuff. So I actually think that is the next level of hyper-personalization, right? Where we think about back in the day, I was thinking about things like customized interfaces that change based on if I want to see a video, if I could convert better by viewing a video versus reading a block of copy. Some people are visual learners, auditory learners, whatever. Now I'm like, is the I don't know, is an interface a thing anymore? I don't even know anymore, right? Yeah. How are we? There's a hologram. Yeah. Is that am I dealing in the metaverse now? Are we bringing that back? I don't know, but I think when you start to open the door beyond simply me asking a question, getting a response, even maybe taking an action, you start to get into 3 or 4 dimensions on this stuff. Wow, cool stuff.
Yeah, really cool stuff, and that dynamic path now is becoming way more. I don't want to say mainstream, but way more doable than ever, right? To your point, hey, if someone is better at reading versus watching a video, right? You can naturally change the next thing in, I don't know, the quote unquote funnel, but just in the experience in general, right?
Totally. Well, we used to talk about it. So we do a lot of work in journeys, right? Understanding how people find their way from point A to point Z and become, a customer and turn from prospect to customer, and then ultimately, stay a customer and are retained, right?
Right.
But it's never linear, right? It's never I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this. And maybe sometimes it is, but I think especially B2B, right? There's maybe 10 people involved in that, right? And then every company shaped a little bit differently, and then how they need to consume that information, whether they're the IT buyer or the marketing buyer or whoever in that sales cycle, right? All the more reason why context matters. All the more reason why taking all those pieces and pulling them all together and getting to that hyper-personalized part of the conversation is so important.
So important. I totally agree. All right. So I got to ask you, how about, as to me, agentic AI is now, really starting to take shape. So, and this is where, for everybody watching just in the audience, the workflow automations from agentic AI are going to change companies very quickly. And Mike, I want to get your perspective on what you're seeing and how you guys are coaching clients through.
Narrow use cases. I think what people have, this happens all the time in new technology, but AI has been probably the worst thing. Is all of a sudden these tools become magical or unicorns, and it's not magic. You still need to, at the end of the day, understand an existing workflow. You still need to understand what's painful about it. You still need to understand from a business perspective where, those friction points are costing dollars, right? All of that has to happen. And maybe we can think about how agents can identify that, blah, 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 blah. But before you actually implement an agentic workflow, you have to understand the existing problems in order to really help to solve them. Right. So a lot of what we are looking at and starting to apply are really simple use cases, right? Pivot points where I'm making a decision between A, B, and C, right? I think a good example of this is, we have a client that's trying to integrating conversational AI into their buyer journey. And they're basically trying to figure out whether or not somebody has an FAQ generally about the business and cross-section between that and then product information.
Right.
Maybe they have some conversation or idea about both. So in that case, right, okay, you need to sort of figure out how to sort of mold the response back to what they're looking for. It's a perfect use case for an agent. Like an agent's going to go in and say, all right, well, I see that you're doing this. I see that you're doing this. I see that you're doing this. So let me give you back this kind of information. Right? It's small, but it's a good example of how we can start to take those actions and we can start to make them a little more bite-sized, as opposed to trying to like sit there and go, yep, I want this agent to replace these 50 people who are doing this job for the last 20 years, right? Like, doesn't make a ton of sense because then there's institutional knowledge you're removing with that. Right. There's all sorts of like, there are so many companies, especially like mid-market companies who duct tape solutions together for years, who, you know, so-and-so and accounting has like so much knowledge baked in their head. And yeah, they're a little bit of a bottleneck, sure, but like you can't just like take that out of an organization. You have to be human-centric when we're thinking about how we create these solutions. So one, it's important to start small. It's important to start with those little routines that you can start to like actually make better workflows for. Two, and what I was saying there about being human-centered, getting people involved in the process. We are huge believers. We are experience-centric, and that means we're trying to solve problems for people. We are trying to make people's lives better with these solutions. We are not just simply trying to replace jobs and activities. We are trying to smooth out the processes. So in order to do that, you know, we really need to understand from those people what's the role they're going to play in making sure that end-to-end routine can kind of get done effectively. Especially when you're talking about things like knowledge management, or you're talking about actions that need to be taken within maybe a sales routine or something. Like a good example is, instead of having someone pull together, you know, a proposal, right, is if we can automate the workflow on that and then just have the person chime in about the few specific things that are going to make it unique, right? Like that's interesting, and that's an interesting use case. I think really where it's going to get super interesting is the kind of third part of that discussion is in trust. Is where we think about how well are people really going to trust agents to make final decisions on things, right? Especially if you're talking about like regulated industries, things like, I don't know, if you're sort of rating insurance policies, right? Or, you know, somewhere something like is going to matter that a human signs off on it, right? Is it probably 100% necessary that a human completely signs off on those things? Kind of up for debate depending on what we're talking about. But like, I think that sort of trade-off is kind of the last big thing where agents are going to run up against a wall where what are people really going to be comfortable with? What is the risk that kind of comes along with that? And where does that leave us then in our various businesses as far as the agents are concerned?
Really, really interesting perspective, because I agree with you on the simple use cases. Yeah, the forward thinking about how far you take them and let the AI be autonomous is, it's a bridge too far in my opinion right now. But like, I think about some simple things like we had a client who had a Jira workflow, right? And but the front end, you know, they have these complicated forms, right? And I'm like, why can't you just have an AI interface that asks them, what are you trying to accomplish, right? And it's either a change request, a product idea, or an issue, right? But you don't need to ask a user who may not know, right, to pick those categories in a drop-down list. You can actually ask them how much they know, and then move it to the next team member to finish it through the same interface, right? And then actually you get the right categorization and the right information, right? Simple things like that, to me, like companies aren't thinking through. They're trying to. I think you're right. I think that some of them they get maybe paralyzed by how do I implement this? And I think if they take your advice and just say, how can I do something very simple and get my feet wet, right? And go, okay, I can now see that impact. Maybe I now map a workflow out and figure out what are the analytics and metrics I need to track through that, right?
Oh, you hit on a very good point there as well, the analytics, and actually thinking about KPIs throughout that process. I think this is also where people slip up when it comes to even agentic planning is I want to automate a workflow without firmly understanding what are the core KPIs I'm trying to impact. And it isn't necessarily related to that workflow. And now what we always push clients to think about is what is the larger business implication? What is the larger business metric that this is going to fundamentally change down the road? And the reason you think about things like that is because that more simple workflow might be a small part in a bigger mechanism. And in which case, then it's the bigger mechanism ultimately that we're trying to think about, right? So it might not be worth our time and energy there if we can go spend our time and energy automating something over here that's fundamentally going to hit that that prime target, right? So, I
Right.
mean, yeah, you hit on something there that I think is really crucial. But one other thing there too, which is um, going back to this idea of human in the loop. I do think it's very important that we think about, very deliberate about the design of these systems and thinking about every stage of that and then involving people in the process of developing them. Because I think there's parts of that process where unintended consequences or unintended outcomes can happen and things where we weren't expecting, certain results. When that happens, it's important to have a human on the other end to sort of course correct, right?
Yeah.
Critical to this whole thing is making sure that people are involved.
Totally agree. Couldn't agree more. You hit on so many good topics here. Again, I could probably go down 5 rabbit holes with you on this because it's so important. And I love the fact that you have that perspective of where it is today versus where it's going to be in 5 years, right? Yep. And we need to, kind of use it to its best and highest use in a responsible way right now. So, Mike, I told you I was going to ask a couple ending questions. One is give some people some founder tips on using AI, like things you do yourself to make yourself more efficient or productive.
Yeah. So the number one time suck in my life is communication. Especially as a founder. I'm a co-founder, I have a business partner. I would say if I think about all the things that co-founders have to do, it is that line of sight into making sure that you are clearly articulating whatever, whether it's strategy, whether it's a simple email, whatever the case is. To me, that communication is the biggest thing that I use AI for. Now, truthfully, I use a handful of AI tools. Some are plugged into the email platforms we work with, et cetera. But really, I use ChatGPT for like 90% of my workflow efficiency. I have custom GPTs for all sorts of things, depending on what I'm trying to do, whether that's, build proposals or communicate, requirements for or potential requirements for projects. I am the chief innovation officer at O3, so I oversee new product services as well as our AI initiatives. So I still get my feet wet quite a bit with some of the work that we do. So in all of that, like there's different use cases for these things, but none of it is, press a button and output, the information. I'm very much being thoughtful about where are those parts in my process where like I'm going to like, that's a tedious part that I don't want to do. Right. Can I take the meeting notes, pop the meeting notes into a GPT, create, summary and potentially a follow-up email with the action items that I need, plus some additional information that I know that I want to include because we're at a certain part in this conversation, right? There's stuff like that where like I have become certainly not a master, but much better at streamlining my communication so that my volume of conversations that I can have over the course of a day is probably 2-3x what it used to be. Number of emails I send a day is actually like a kind of a key metric for me, right? Like what emails and sort of pieces of information. To take me 15 minutes, 20 minutes to sit down and write, a proper email to, a potential target, a client, an employee, right? When I'm trying to be super thoughtful about how I'm verbalizing the things that I'm trying to pull together. Again, context.
Yeah.
And now that we have a lot of that information, and I'm very careful about what I share with ChatGPT as far as client communication is concerned, all that.
Yeah.
But the more I can make that easier for myself, I mean, I think it's critical. Now there's all sorts of other tools that we use just to, from everywhere, from design and dev across the board. We are an organization that practices what we preach. We're constantly looking at new things to, new tools to implement in our workflows, et cetera, just like every organization should be doing. But for me personally, that's the big one. I think where you can start to be thoughtful about the content you're producing, how you're producing it, and how you're communicating it in a much more efficient, effective, and what I'm finding, because I'm not trying to rush through an email anymore, is effective way. I think that's critical.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love that. A lot of tips in there, a lot of really good ideas too. So last question. Is we always talk about growth. And so hypothetically, if I gave you a magic wand and you could use it to clear one obstacle to help you guys O3 grow, and meet or exceed whatever your growth targets are, what would you use it for?
Wow, what a great question. If I think about where we really have a lot of friction in so first of all, like we've done a very good job of sort of doing all the things you're supposed to do, expanding pipeline, improving marketing opportunities, driving new content. I mean, we're constantly doing things like this so that, we can get our voice and our ideas out there, right? So all of those things are important. And I would say we've done a very good job of really streamlining that. But I will say, I think reach is still a challenge, right? Reach is one of those things where I'm trying to get the right message in front of the right customer at the
right time. Yep.
Right? And I will say, generally speaking, I mean, there's all sorts of avenues we go down that the typical marketers will go down. And we are leveraging AI to turn our small marketing team into a team of 20. No, they're not. That's to really, make these things work, right? So all of that has been critical. But if I had to wave a wand, really being able to effectively find the right folks at the right moment, and they have the problem where we have the solution. I think that's the number one thing that any business is trying to find, right? Streamlining that process such that the information we're putting out in the world really does hit that mark to really pull people in, so that we are maximizing the amount of conversations we're having. So the value and the quality of the information that we're producing keeps getting better and better. And by the way, it is getting better and better. It's just the speed at which we're doing that, right? That hyper-personalized targeting gets better and better. I think that's probably the thing, right? Because it's not that, I think we're doing a very good job of sort of moving in the right direction with all this. I think we're not using AI for AI's sake. I feel very good that we are focused on key business strategic insights to really drive a lot of those decisions, and it's effectively paying off. But I think that's just the hard thing, I don't care how big of an organization you are, even with all the resources in the world, at the end of the day, finding the right person at the right time, right problem to solve is still that's it right there, right?
Quality
That's the
at bats to put your message, and the at bats had to it's timing too of those at bats. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Totally. So that's probably it. I mean, and especially when we're talking about growth, I think that's really where you can accelerate quite a bit, shortening that path to purchase. Right.
Yep. Absolutely.
And, I think that's really where truly when we think about the customer space, customer experience space, that's probably where AI is going to have the biggest impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. Well, Mike, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your insights. I think this is going to be a really fun podcast to get up and running, and get live. And, just can't thank you enough for sharing your insights.
I really appreciate it, Brent. It was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to following up on some more stuff here.
Absolutely. And we'll put all the links below when this goes live, but tell everybody how to get in touch with you in the meantime.
Sure. Actually, I have two things. So one is o3world.com. That's the letter O, not the number. So o3world.com. That is our website. That's all our products and services. We also host an annual conference called 1682. We are headquartered in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was founded in 1682.
Oh, I love that.
It is the tagline is the Business of Innovation Conference, where we will be talking about all of this stuff, real world case studies and AI, and really trying to solve a whole bunch of problems for people. So if anybody's interested, that is up and live, and that will be in October 8th.
Well, I'm a Philly boy, so I may have to come up and visit you. That's fantastic. Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you again, Mike. And for all the viewers out there, like I said, the AI, you need to embrace it. To Mike's point, you need to simplify and start with simple use cases. But the quicker you embrace it, the quicker you can start to solve problems and become more efficient. Because let me tell you one thing, your competition is looking into it, so you better. Yeah,
for sure.
All right. Well, thank you. This wraps up this episode of Future Proofed, and thanks to Mike Gadsby, and we will see you on the next episode.
If you're ready to embrace change and lead with innovation, be sure to subscribe and never miss an episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Future Proof Podcast.